is Matthew Moore and I'm a second year PhD student from the University of Wolverhampton. My presentation today is going to be focusing on the idea of symbiotic connections and entangled ecosystems in the work of H.G. Wells. Now, H.G. Wells has been analysed for doing many things, but one of the things that his fiction has not always been analysed from the angle of is the idea of ecological thinking and the idea that he is a pro-environmentalist that is very much adumbrating many of the issues and concerns that we have in our society at the moment to do with climate change, to do with the way in which we are a interconnected species with nature. And I argue in my work so far and in my research that is very much the case of H.G. Wells's work. I want to begin with a quotation from Charles Darwin's work on the origin of species, in which he says, "It's interesting to contemplate an entangled bank, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing on the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth, and to reflect these elaborately constructed forms, so differently from each other and dependent on each other in so complex a manner, have all been produced by laws acting around us." Now, for me, I want to argue that at the core of Wells's work, it cannot be denied that Wells is actually engaging with this issue. Darwin points out that these constructed forms are different yet dependent, and that is the key that we see with humankind and animal kind. Yes, animal kind is presented in some cases as different to humankind, but nevertheless they are dependent upon each other, and there is those inextricable ties that we see Wells very much explore in his fiction. And John Glending goes on to say that the entangled bank metaphor enables Darwin to purposely emphasise the need for orderly ecological interdependence, and that's very key to Wells's work. He does show that need for interdependence if humanity is to survive, and actually when one species goes against another, we see the consequences of that in his fiction. As well, I want to just draw attention to Adam Roberts and his very influential piece that surveys the work of H.G. Wells, and he argues that something was on Wells's mind, a Darwinian something. Now, I want to take the idea of that something, and I want to argue very much at the centrepiece of Wells's work, this idea of the something being the idea of the entangled bank, the idea that we are connected to each other, all species are connected to one another, and there is no way of avoiding that. So what I want to do in part of my presentation today is go through some of the key readings that we see in Wells's fiction in relation to the idea of entanglement. So I want to start off first of all with Robert Weeks' perspective when he argues that Wells aims to drop the theme of disentanglement. But I have a particular issue with this view. I don't think Wells does drop the theme of disentanglement. In fact, I believe that he does the opposite. He actually shows the importance of entanglement and that it is necessary to be an entangled species. So I want to argue that Wells portrays the consequences of a fragmented relationship with other life forms, and obviously I want to argue that if society, if humanity continues to have this fragmented relationship, then it will simply accelerate the chaos in the ecosystem, which we see evidence of in his work. Undoubtedly, in Wells's fiction, we do see a turbulent relationship between nature and humanity, and that cannot be denied. However, he illustrates that death by extinction is depicted as the worst outcome, and therefore the turbulence is necessary. A tug-of-war relationship very much is necessary for the survival of the species. Gold in Gold argues that humanity is being forced to rethink how they see themselves, and they seek to complicate the oneness as well as the boundness of the person, formerly known as the individual. And I want to argue that actually Wells does clearly adumbrate this, because he does demonstrate that we are a complex, as Gold says, we are a complex assemblage of living and non-living elements, and that we are interacting organisms and subsystems. And again, Wells demonstrates this in his work. So I want to carry on then now by arguing that Tom Hennigan argues that the environmental landscapes within fiction often presents man as living at first in wild nature and establishing their presence in what is at the beginning of alien territory. But in Wells's fiction, this presence is dissolved, and that actually mankind masters a wide range of environments and slowly wins a certain freedom, is also demonstrated and also explored, because the idea of master is important, but Wells indicates that mastery over the life forms cannot be assumed, and nor is it beneficial for survival. And obviously we know that Wells loathed complacency, and he wanted to very much challenge this idea of complacency and show that it's wrong for us to be a complacent species, which, if we think about our perspective in society right now, and I often don't like to dwell on COVID-19 and things, but if we think about our perspective right now, Wells wasn't too far off the mark, in the sense that we shouldn't be complacent because other organisms, other viruses, other bacteria can threaten the survival of a species and threaten its existence in a wider ecosystem. So it's clear that Wells really wants to argue that unless society and unless humanity works to accept the idea of entanglement, unless that happens, then death by extinction will happen, but also that it's also inevitable for extinction to happen, which, you know, that pessimistic notion of extinction is going to happen, because at the end of it we have entropy that is going to affect all life forms in some way, and obviously that's at the heart of Wells's thinking. So Plumwood argues that Western culture is often backgrounded nature, but this is where Wells really was revolutionary in his thinking, because in each of his narratives he actually positions nature at the centre of his narrative and intertwines it with human experience. I want to talk about here his influential short story that has received very limited scholarly attention, called The Sea Raiders. And in this narrative, it is the natural world that seems to dominate and the giant squid that is referred to as being a peculiar species is the one that threatens the survival of humanity. And the giant squids are also described as possessing tentacles that were already pouring over the rocky ridge. And I think this is very representative of the idea of entanglement, because of the idea of tentacles being able to wrap around items, and it very much symbolises humanity as being pulled into a shared ecosystem, perhaps, very much like the entangled bank idea of being dependent but also different at the same time. The way in which the tentacles are also described as already pouring could also reflect Wells's vision that humanity and nature have always been connected, and it is humanity's fault in a sense because they failed to accept this. The present participle of pouring is also significant because it creates that idea of overflowing, and it mirrors the sort of arrogance of humanity, because it's very much blinded them from seeing what's right in front of them, that actually there is that deep-seated relationship between man and nature, and therefore they should have recognised it sooner rather than later. Pouring also has a semantic connotations really of a lack of control and overflowing, and I think this also presents the squids as impossible to stop, and it depicts them as a persistent threat to humanity until they have been fully assimilated into the shared ecosystem. So whilst the Sea Raiders begins in that light, we then need to think about what does this look like in the War of the Worlds, for instance, which is much more popular really than and has been analysed more so than the Sea Raiders, which has received very limited scholarly attention. The War of the Worlds does show the same portrayal of nature in that it has a very great function. It's not backgrounded, as Plumwood argues is typical in fiction, and it's in the novel. The organic blends with other life forms. So from the outset, we see the narrator labelling the green as the dominant colour, when in opposition with the vivid blood red tint of the red weed that that shrouds the entirety of Victorian society. Now, it's clear that there is ecophobic sentiments that are displayed in Wells's constructs across his overall, really, because I think there is that sense of fear of nature, and there is that ecophobia and that fear of accepting that actually nature could be just as powerful as humankind. So I do think it reflects that kind of idea. But I think it's worth noting that the contrasting colours of green and blood red could signify how two organic life forms can share similar characteristics whilst also being at odds with each other, and therefore reflecting that idea of difference but also dependency on each other. I think it's also worth considering that the idea of the different colours could represent maybe the way in which one species will attempt to triumph over the other in one way or another. Wells also suggests that it is necessary for life forms to reach a mutual coexistence, and that it is the life form's responsibility to recognise that neither of them can hold a master position. So in the time machine, as we see, it is the man-made structures that are rendered passive, and that happens in the War of the Worlds as well. It happens very much in all of Wells's fiction. But I think what he's trying to demonstrate is that a species on an evolutionary level is very fluid and interchangeable, and as Glending argues, inherent in Darwin's thinking is the idea that chance, contingency and also unpredictability is central, and we do see that idea of unpredictability in Wells's fiction as part of this idea of the entangled bank bringing the unpredictability, because it is the humanity's unwillingness to accept that they are entangled with not only species within their own planet, but across a wider solar system, and it's because they cannot see that unpredictability happens. Throughout Wells's The War of the Worlds, there is the interesting imagery of the red weed, and this is very significant when we're considering the idea of entanglement. The red weed from the outset infiltrates the man-made landscape, shrouds it, contaminates it, and takes it over by storm. The narrator observes how the neighbouring houses had all been wrecked, with smashed windows and shattered doors. However, whilst man-made structures are torn apart by the Martians, the red weed seemingly seems to take humanity and dominate the environment by force. It's worth looking at the the idea of wrecked, smashed and shattered, all reflecting this idea of brutality and destruction, and also demonstrates the unpredictability that can happen within an ecosystem as well, that one species will always be threatened by another. As we know that doors do provide entrances and exits, but also provide privacy to us so we can shut things off, the way in which the doors are broken down, I think, is very symbolic of the idea of humanity as becoming exposed, as becoming vulnerable and unable to shield themselves from the Martians and their power and dominance. Now, alongside that, Leon Voskuil argues that the red weed motif that's at the heart of a War of the Worlds argues that it portrays a fin de siècle nightmare. But I think it's not only a nightmare for that period, but it's also a very stark warning for us now. And as I said, if we think about our current situation and the current climate we are in and the current fears that are surrounding us, it's very clear that those issues are still there now and are still a nightmare for us to consider even now. So the Martian invasion does force them to readdress their position within the wider ecosystem. And we see that the entanglement between each life form is depicted when the narrator says the red weed grew with astonishing vigour and luxuriance. It spread up the side of the pit, and its cactus-like branches formed a carmine fringe to the edge of our triangular window, and afterwards I found it broadcast through the country, and especially where there was a stream of water. So Wells is clearly illustrating here that it only requires one other life form within the ecosystem to usurp the supposed dominant species. The verbs grew and spread portray the red weed as unstoppable, and that it is expanding the dominion across the planet. The way that the red weed emerges out of the side of the pit could perhaps represent it as a satanic force, and that it has originated from the depths of hell. The negative depiction of the red weed also illustrates the ecophobic sentiments that I talked about earlier, that filtered through the 19th century. And rather than humanity trying to understand the organism, it's clear that they try to otherize it and push it away, rather than getting to see what it's about and understanding it, and they push it to one side. Alternatively, the way that the red weed breaks out of the pit could also represent how the life forms within the ecosystem are determined to latch on to others. And the narrator also assumes that the red weed is just confined to this external space, yet when he realises that it had broadcast itself throughout the country, it is presented as integrating itself with humanity. When a programme is broadcast, it is difficult to avoid becoming saturated by it, representing the red weed as an unescapable force that is triumphing over humanity. The conflict that emerges in the response to entanglement is illustrated further in the War of the Worlds, when the narrator states that the red weed had grown right across the hole in the wall to turn the half-light of the place into a crimson-coloured obscurity. The way in which the red weed covers the hole in the wall could potentially symbolise how one species can entrap another, especially as the hole provides an escape route, and the narrator cannot break through it. Alternatively, the hole acts as a small exit, perhaps mirroring how the dominance of humanity has been reduced, something that I think we're recognising in our current context, in that we have to look to nature and recognise that nature can be a powerful force to be reckoned with. The contrast between half-light and the crimson-coloured obscurity may also signal the disparity between the two life forms. Light, we know, is associated with goodness and having heavenly connotations, but the crimson-coloured obscurity conveys the idea that the Martians have stained and intoxicated the planet, and thus tarnished the human realm. Perhaps then, humanity is recognising that they are no longer an authentic species, and their integration with other life forms has almost seemingly rendered them as impure. It's also significant that the plant life that the Martians bring with them is labelled as red weed, in contrast to the terrestrial plants on Earth. Weeds are undoubtedly categorised as unwanted, as pests that we, even if we think about doing a spot of gardening, we often see that those are the weeds again, and we have to dig them out and get rid of them, or use weed killer to get rid of them. But again, this represents the ecophobic attitudes that very much permeated society during the 19th century. The way that they compete with other plants could mirror the relationship that humanity has with nature, and that it is threatening their dominance. It may also portray the idea that competition is simply a byproduct of entanglement, as well as is displaying that all life forms are part of the same wider ecosystem. Weeds have the potential to shroud and suffocate other plant life, representing humanity and their acquired position as easily threatened by other ecological beings. As weeds can tangle with other plant life, it could also demonstrate Wells's view that all life forms are bound together and intertwined together. Also, it's worth considering that weeds are, without a doubt, persistent and resurge, and this could symbolise, from the point of view of Wells's fiction, that humanity will always be at the mercy of other threats until they accept that they are not the sole occupants of the planet. What is more, the red weed is also labelled as the red creeper during the novel, and creeper has interesting connotations, I feel, as creeper could reflect Wells's central idea that a species can be consumed without warning and that they can be taken by surprise. And I think if we think about our current context, thinking about the pandemic and how the pandemic has affected us, again, this could represent the idea that any species can be taken by surprise very, very quickly. Alternatively, when something creeps, it creates the impression of secrecy and therefore portrays the red weed as devious and calculating, and demonstrates how one species can be merged with another without detection. It's clear then that creeper might be symbolic of wider ecological concerns that Wells is clearly adumbrating, especially surrounding climate change and the consequences that mark the Anthropocene era. In particular, the idea of Rob Nixon's slow violence, the idea that these things, these issues, like climate change, can just creep upon us without detection, and it's only until it reaches its maximum point, really, that we do start to take note. And that's very much in our present context. We've seen climate change become more and more of an issue, and now we're starting to recognise the effects of that and see the effects that is having upon us. So that idea of slow violence is something that Wells has adumbrated even before it had been coined as a concept. As well, the natural imagery of red weed and terrestrial plants, Wells is illuminating that power can be lost very easily when a greater force in the ecosystem takes centre stage. For instance, it's interesting to note that by the end of the novel, the red weed very much perishes. The very dominant red weed that spread far and wide and infiltrated the entirety of the planet is described as suffering from a cankering disease, but it is the terrestrial plants that are resisting power. And it's clear that the reversal of fortune that we see with the red weed here is used by Wells to mirror humanity's fate, and that fate is very clear. If they deny the need for combining with other life forms, they will perish. The phrase "in the end" almost normalises the extinction of the red weed, suggesting that no species has permanence or has the capacity to stand the test of time without alterations occurring. Despite the powerful influence of both the Martians and the red weed, the verb succumbed portrays them as becoming the victim of a greater force that threatens their survival, which is obviously bacteria. Altogether then, Wells is demonstrating that humanity faces the same unpredictable circumstances that other life forms can undergo and experience. Seized also conveys this idea, as it represents the idea of weed as having the capacity to paralyse and entrap humanity which could foreshadow how humanity will have a reduced position following the way in which they will be consumed by them. As well, this is highlighted further with references to a cancering disease, and as a disease is difficult to remedy and infiltrates the entire body, it indicates that extinction is irreversible once it has been unleashed. Also, when the narrator says that redweed had faded as quickly as it had spread, it illustrates Wells's vision that power by a dominant force is short-lived when they strive to take command of the wider ecosystem without equally distributing it. This is conveyed further through the semantic field of decay with rotted, bleached, shrivelled and brittle, all of which present the redweed as having lost the battle against Earth's natural forces. Furthermore, this semantic field portrays the redweed as having become weakened, which may reflect the deterioration that humanity will go on to experience unless they adopt an ecocentric mindset rather than an anthropocentric mindset. Also, the way in which the redweed is very much bleached represents how its identity has been lost, and as bleach removes stains and cleanses, it conveys Wells's prediction that humanity will undergo the same process. So, altogether then, it's very clear that in Wells's fiction he adumbrates the idea of the entangled bank, and also engages with what many ecological thinkers are exploring, such as the idea of the mesh that Morton explores in his work, the idea that we are interconnected species, the idea that we are ecological beings and that we are part of a wider ecosystem. And throughout all of his fiction, Wells is arguing that we must recognise sooner rather than later that we are an interconnected species, regardless of what we think, regardless of how superior we think we are as a species. We are part of a wider ecosystem, and the sooner we recognise that, the better. And I think really Wells is, without a doubt, a visionary, and he is very much a pro-environmentalist, and he's arguing that unless we recognise that we are better connected than disconnected, then we are going to face problems as we go forward as a species. So overall then, in Wells's fiction we see categorically the idea of the importance of recognising and embracing entanglement, that it isn't a bad thing, it's actually something that humanity needs to embrace. And I think when we look back at Wells's fiction now and go back to it, I think it teaches us a very important lesson about really we should have embraced that close, intimate relationship with nature rather than relying on the industrial and actually developing that relationship from the outset, because maybe we may not be facing the same problems that we are today. But I do think Wells demonstrates through the idea of the entanglement, the entangled bank idea, that unless we are willing to accept that we need to be connected, we cannot survive as a species, we cannot go alone being disconnected. Thank you very much for listening and watching my presentation, and I hope that you have found it useful.